The note was written in shaky, uneven letters, the kind you'd expect from a child's trembling hand. 3 words. Not hidden in a diary, not whispered to a friend, but scribbled on a school project, right there in front of everyone. Help me. At first, Mrs. Callahan thought it had to be a mistake, a silly joke, but the look in the little girl's eyes told her otherwise. Eyes that were pleading, terrified, and silently begging for someone to finally notice. What Mrs. Callahan didn't know was that this cry for help would pull her into a secret so dark, it would shatter everything she thought she knew about her students, and put her in danger she never saw coming. Mrs. Callahan had been teaching at Crestwood Elementary for nearly 20 years. She was known for her patience, her warm smile, and the way she always kept a bowl of peppermints on her desk for nervous students. Her classroom was cheerful. Paper sunflowers lined the windows, and the smell of sharpened pencils mixed with faint lemon cleaner. The sound of chatter echoed gently, but she always noticed when something was off. The little girl's name was Emily Carter. She was 9 years old, with blonde hair that fell in uneven pigtails and big blue eyes that rarely met anyone else's. Emily was quiet, painfully so. While other children laughed and whispered, Emily worked silently, as if she lived in another world. Mrs. Callahan bent over Emily's desk, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Sweetheart, what's this?" she whispered, pointing at the words on the project. Emily's small hands instantly covered the paper. "Nothing. I messed up." But her voice cracked, betraying her. Mrs. Callahan gently placed her hand on Emily's, but the little girl pulled away like she'd been burned. That was the first sign. Something was deeply wrong. The next day, Mrs. Callahan watched Emily more closely. During recess, Emily sat alone on the swings while other children laughed on the jungle gym. She stared at the ground, twisting the toe of her shoe into the dirt. When another girl asked if she wanted to play tag, Emily shook her head, mumbling, "I can't." Later, while lining up for lunch, Emily flinched when someone brushed her shoulder. She muttered, "Sorry, sorry," over and over, even though she'd done nothing wrong. Mrs. Callahan's unease deepened. That evening, she stayed late at her desk, rereading Emily's project. Behind the messy glue and cutouts, there were faint eraser marks on the branches of the tree. Words that had been rubbed out. With careful eyes, Mrs. Callahan made them out, "Not safe." The following week, a parent-teacher conference brought Emily's mother into the classroom. Laura Carter looked tired, her hair pulled into a rushed bun, her smile stretched too thin. She apologized for Emily being so quiet. "She's just shy," Laura said, tapping her nails nervously against the desk. But something didn't sit right. When Mrs. Callahan mentioned Emily's difficulty participating, Laura's expression tightened. "She'll be fine," she cut in quickly. "She just needs to toughen up." And then, for a brief moment, Mrs. Callahan noticed something. Emily's eyes darted toward her mother, wide and filled with fear. That night, Mrs. Callahan couldn't sleep. She replayed the look on Emily's face. She remembered something else, too. When Emily had turned in her math homework, there was a small doodle in the corner of the page. A house, drawn in dark crayon, with bars on the windows. And inside, a stick figure, holding up a sign. A tiny square speech bubble that simply read, "Help." At the time, Mrs. Callahan thought it was just a child's imagination. Now, she wasn't so sure. One Friday afternoon, during art class, Mrs. Callahan walked the rows as students painted. She stopped at Emily's desk. The little girl was painting a picture of her family. A man stood tall in the center. A woman stood beside him. And then, smaller figures, Emily and what looked like a younger brother. But what made Mrs. Callahan's chest tighten was the expression. The father's face was drawn with sharp lines, his mouth an angry slash. Emily's figure stood in the corner, far away from the others, her eyes scribbled out in black paint. Mrs. Callahan leaned down gently. "Emily, who's this?" she asked, pointing at the tall figure. Emily's brush stilled. Her lips trembled. "And barely above a whisper," she said. "Don't tell." The truth broke wide open a week later. Emily's class was working on journals. Most kids wrote about their pets, their favorite movies, or weekend trips to the park. But when Mrs. Callahan collected Emily's notebook, she froze. On the first page, in jagged handwriting, Emily had written, "If you're reading this, please help me. My dad hurts us when no one is looking." Mrs. Callahan's breath caught in her throat. She turned the page with shaking hands. There were drawings. Crude, childlike, but horrifying. A stick figure lying on the ground. Another towering over it with a belt. And in the corner of every drawing, a small figure. Emily, crying. That evening, Mrs. Callahan sat in her car in the school parking lot, clutching the notebook. She knew she had to call someone. CPS, the police, anyone. But as she looked up, headlights swept across her windshield. A dark SUV pulled into the lot. A tall man stepped out. Broad shoulders, cold eyes. Emily's father. He walked toward the school doors, his movements heavy and deliberate. He carried himself like someone who owned the ground he walked on. Mrs. Callahan's pulse hammered in her throat. What was he doing here? At this hour? Before she could react, the man's voice boomed across the empty lot. "You the teacher?" His tone was flat, almost accusing. Mrs. Callahan's fingers tightened around the notebook. "Yes," she managed to say. The man's eyes flicked to the book in her hands. His jaw clenched. "That mine?" he asked coldly. Her heart sank. He knew. That night, Mrs. Callahan didn't go home right away. She drove aimlessly, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. She'd handed the journal to the school principal, who promised to look into it. But Mrs. Callahan didn't feel relief. She felt watched. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A folded piece of paper was tucked under her windshield wiper. She got out, hands trembling, and unfolded it. The words were scrawled in the same jagged handwriting she'd seen in Emily's journal. "Please don't leave me." Mrs. Callahan stared into the darkness of the street, clutching the note. If Emily didn't put this here, then who did? And that's when she realized this story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Mrs. Callahan could still feel the paper trembling in her hands. "Please don't leave me." Those words followed her into her dreams, echoing in the silence of her bedroom, in the hum of her classroom, in the empty hallways of the school. But the worst part wasn't the note itself. It was the question no one could answer. If Emily didn't leave that message on her car, then who did? The next morning, Mrs. Callahan arrived at school early. She unlocked her classroom door, set her bag down, and froze. Her desk drawer, the one she kept locked, was open. Inside, Emily's journal was gone. Her stomach dropped. She raced down the hall to the principal's office. I gave you the journal," she stammered. "Where is it?" Principal Hayes frowned. "You must be mistaken. I never got it." Her blood went cold. She knew she had handed it over. So where was it now? Later that day, Mrs. Callahan spotted Emily in the cafeteria. The little girl sat hunched over her tray, not touching her food. When Mrs. Callahan knelt beside her, Emily's eyes darted nervously toward the windows. "They took it," Emily whispered. "He knows." Mrs. Callahan's pulse quickened. "Who knows, sweetheart? What did they take?" But before Emily could answer, A tall shadow fell over the table. It was Emily's father. He stood in the doorway, watching. His gaze locked onto Mrs. Callahan, his lips curling into something between a smile and a warning. Emily's fork clattered against her tray. Her tiny body shrank into the seat. That evening, Mrs. Callahan couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. When she stopped at the grocery store, she noticed the same black SUV parked across the lot. When she drove home, headlights appeared in her rearview mirror and stayed there for 6 blocks. And when she finally pulled into her driveway, the SUV slowed at the curb before driving off. Inside her house, she locked every door and window. But no amount of locks could quiet the sound of Emily's whisper replaying in her mind. He knows. The next morning, Mrs. Callahan called Child Protective Services. She explained everything, the journal, the drawings, the notes. But the caseworker's tone was cautious. Do you have physical evidence? Something we can present? Mrs. Callahan hesitated. The journal was gone. The note from her car, she'd lost it in her panic. I had them, she whispered. Without them, the caseworker said gently, there's not much we can do right now. Her hands shook as she hung up. Somehow, the evidence was disappearing. Someone was making sure of it. That week, during computer lab, Mrs. Callahan noticed Emily typing furiously while the other kids played educational games. She walked past Emily's screen and froze. Emily wasn't playing. She was writing an email. The subject line read, "Please save us." And the message itself was just as chilling. He says if I tell, he'll make it worse. But I don't want my brother to get hurt. Please tell someone. Please. Before Mrs. Callahan could react, the screen blinked. The email disappeared. Emily's eyes widened in panic. He sees everything, she whispered. That night, Mrs. Callahan's phone buzzed with an anonymous text. It was a photo. Her classroom, taken from the window outside. Below it, a message. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it. Her breath hitched. Someone wasn't just threatening Emily. They were watching her too. 2 days later, Mrs. Callahan made a choice. She couldn't sit quietly anymore. She waited until dismissal, then asked Emily to stay behind to help tidy up. When the other kids left, she knelt by Emily's desk. You can trust me, Mrs. Callahan said softly. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She shook her head violently. You don't understand, she whispered. It's not just him. It's everyone. Mrs. Callahan blinked. What do you mean? But before Emily could answer, the classroom door creaked open. Emily's father stepped inside. His eyes flicked from his daughter to Mrs. Callahan. And in his hand was Emily's missing journal. The room went silent. Mrs. Callahan's throat went dry as the man walked closer, setting the journal on her desk with a heavy thud. You've been busy, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Emily gripped Mrs. Callahan's arm, her tiny fingers digging in like claws. Her whole body trembled. Mrs. Callahan opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The man leaned closer, his breath hot with menace. You're making a mistake, he hissed. And then, without another word, he picked up his daughter by the shoulder and marched her out of the room. Mrs. Callahan sat frozen at her desk, staring at the journal he'd left behind. Its cover was torn. Its pages were filled with things she hadn't seen before. And on the very last page, scrawled in jagged red ink, were 4 words that made her blood run cold. She's not my daughter. The words were scratched across the final page in jagged red ink. She's not my daughter. Mrs. Callahan's hands trembled as she held the journal. What did that even mean? Emily had called him Dad. The school records listed him as her father. The family portraits Emily drew, however dark, always had him at the center. So why would he write something like that? And if he wasn't her father, then who was he? That night, Mrs. Callahan photocopied every page of the journal. She slipped the copies into a manila folder, locking it in her filing cabinet at home. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of her house felt like footsteps. Every shadow outside her window felt like someone watching. At 2 a.m., her phone buzzed. A new message. No name, no number. It was a photo. Emily, sitting in a dark room, her face streaked with tears. And beneath it, 4 chilling words. Don't trust anyone else. The next morning, Mrs. Callahan went to the police. She laid out the journal, the copies, the text messages. Detective Alan Cross, a gruff man with tired eyes, listened carefully. "This is serious," he said. "But without knowing where the child is, our hands are tied. Do you have any idea where they live?" Mrs. Callahan hesitated. Emily had once scribbled an address on the back of her spelling test. A half-erased mistake she quickly tore up. But Mrs. Callahan remembered it. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I do." That evening, Detective Cross agreed to drive past the address with her. The neighborhood was quiet, rows of houses lined with overgrown hedges and peeling paint. And then, there it was. A pale blue house with shutters hanging crooked. In the driveway, the black SUV. Mrs. Callahan's stomach turned. "Stay in the car," the detective ordered. He walked up the path, flashlight in hand. He knocked once, twice. No answer. But as he turned back toward the car, Mrs. Callahan spotted something in the upstairs window. Emily, her tiny hand pressed against the glass. And then, just as quickly, yanked away by someone in the dark. The following morning, Mrs. Callahan rushed to the principal with everything. But instead of relief, Principal Hayes sighed, folding his hands. "Margaret Carter, Emily's mother, called me last night," he said slowly. "She says you've been interfering with her family, accusing them of things without proof. If this continues, the district may have to suspend you." Mrs. Callahan's breath caught. "Suspend me?" The principal leaned closer. "It's best to let this go." But his eyes, cold, steady, unblinking, told her something else. He wasn't warning her. He was silencing her. That afternoon, Mrs. Callahan went back to her classroom. She found a sealed envelope on her desk. No name, no handwriting, just a smear of dirt on the corner. She opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was Emily's handwriting. "He's not my dad. Please help my brother." Her heart dropped. A brother? Mrs. Callahan had never seen another child with Emily. She thought Emily was an only child. But if Emily had a younger brother, then he was in that house too. Mrs. Callahan knew what she had to do. She couldn't go to the school, she couldn't trust the principal, and she couldn't wait for red tape. She drove back to the pale blue house in the dead of night. The street was silent, every porch light off except for one, flickering weakly across the road. She parked 2 houses down, her heart thundering in her chest. And then she saw it. In the upstairs window, Emily again. But this time, she wasn't alone. A smaller child, maybe 5 or 6, stood beside her. His face pale, his lips moving as if he were whispering. And in his tiny hand, a piece of paper pressed to the glass. Mrs. Callahan squinted through the darkness until she could read the words scrawled in crayon. "His coming." Mrs. Callahan gasped, fumbling for her phone to dial Detective Cross. But before she could hit call, headlights flared behind her. The black SUV pulled up slowly, its engine rumbling like a predator's growl. And in her rearview mirror, she saw the driver step out. Not Emily's father. Someone else. Someone she recognized. The black SUV idled behind her, its headlights flooding the pale blue house in harsh white light. Mrs. Callahan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles ached. She expected to see Emily's father step out. But instead, another figure emerged. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted. And in that moment, Mrs. Callahan realized the danger wasn't just outside that house. It was everywhere. The man stepped into the glow of the headlights. Detective Alan Cross. The same detective who had promised to help. Only now, there was no warmth in his tired eyes. Just something cold. Calculated. He shut the SUV door and started walking toward her car, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Callahan's phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down. A new text. It was from an unknown number. Don't trust him. Run. Her pulse quickened. She looked up again, and Cross was already at her window, tapping on the glass. Step out, Mrs. Callahan, he said calmly. She rolled the window down just an inch. Why are you here? She asked, her voice shaking. Cross's jaw tightened. Because you're in over your head. You shouldn't be here. This is dangerous. Dangerous for who? She whispered. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. For everyone. Behind him, the upstairs light flickered. Emily and her brother were gone from the window. Mrs. Callahan's heart pounded. She had to think fast. Where are they? She demanded. Cross didn't answer. Instead, he opened her car door. I said, step out. Her phone buzzed again in her hand. Another message flashed across the screen. He works for him. Mrs. Callahan's mind reeled. He works for him? But before she could react, a new sound split the night. A child's scream, high-pitched, desperate, coming from inside the pale blue house. Mrs. Callahan's instincts overpowered her fear. She shoved the door hard, knocking Cross back a step, and sprinted toward the front porch. The door was locked. She pounded on it, shouting, Emily, it's me. Cross's footsteps pounded behind her, but just as his hand reached for her arm, the door creaked open, and standing there was Emily's mother. Laura Carter's face was pale, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with something between exhaustion and terror. Go home, she whispered. You don't understand what you're doing. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. Where are the children? Laura's lips trembled. She looked over her shoulder into the darkness of the house. And then, barely audible, she whispered, They're not mine. Cross grabbed Mrs. Callahan's wrist. That's enough. But Laura's voice broke through the tension. Stop this, Alan. She deserves to know. Mrs. Callahan's heart raced. Know what? Laura's eyes filled with tears. The children, they don't belong to us. They were taken. The world tilted beneath Mrs. Callahan's feet. Taken, she whispered. Laura nodded, shaking. From somewhere you don't want to know about. Before Mrs. Callahan could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed inside the house. The air grew thick with dread. And then, from the shadows of the hallway, a tall figure emerged. It was the father. His cold eyes locked on Mrs. Callahan. But he wasn't alone. Two other men stepped out behind him, dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially hidden. And in the hands of one man, Emily's journal. The father's voice cut through the silence, low and commanding. You should have walked away, teacher. He tossed the journal onto the floor. Its pages spilled open, revealing new drawings. Ones Mrs. Callahan had never seen before. Each page showed the same thing. Not a house, not a family, but a building. A strange, windowless facility. And beneath the final drawing, Emily's small handwriting. That's where we came from. Mrs. Callahan's breath caught in her throat, because she had seen that building before. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages trembling in the draft from the half-open door. Emily's drawings stared back at Mrs. Callahan. That strange building, the windowless walls, the thick barbed fence. She had seen it once before, years ago, and the memory alone made her stomach turn to ice. Because if Emily was right, if that's where they came from, then these weren't just missing children. They were survivors of something far worse. "Pick it up," the father barked, his voice cutting through the silence. One of the men stooped, retrieving the journal. He handed it to the father, who flipped through the pages carelessly before holding it up to Mrs. Callahan. "You want to know the truth? You really think you can handle it?" Mrs. Callahan's throat went dry. She forced herself to nod. Behind him, Emily clung to her brother's hand at the top of the stairs, her face pale and frightened. Her lips moved silently, forming a word Mrs. Callahan recognized even without sound. "Run." Cross spoke up, his tone sharp. "That's enough. We don't need her involved any further." But the father glared at him. "She's already involved." She saw the message. Laura Carter's voice trembled. "Please, stop this. She's a teacher. She doesn't need to know." Mrs. Callahan's heart pounded. "I'm not leaving until I understand what's happening to those children." The father's eyes narrowed. "Fine. You want the truth? Then come with me." Minutes later, the SUV roared down an empty back road, the headlights slicing through fog. Mrs. Callahan sat in the back seat, wedged between Cross and one of the silent men. Her hands trembled in her lap, her mind racing. Emily's journal was clutched tight against her chest. The father drove in silence, his face unreadable. Laura sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her knuckles white around her seatbelt. The children were not with them. That terrified Mrs. Callahan most of all. At last, the SUV slowed. Through the windshield, a massive structure loomed out of the fog. There it was, the same building Emily had drawn. Gray concrete, windowless, a chain-link fence crowned with razor wire. Mrs. Callahan's breath caught. She knew this place. She had driven past it once on a road trip years ago. Locals whispered about it then. They said it used to be a government research facility, but Emily's words echoed in her mind. That's where we came from. The gates opened without anyone pressing a button, as though they'd been expected. Inside, harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The air reeked of bleach and rust. The halls were lined with metal doors, each marked only with a number. "Where are we?" Mrs. Callahan asked, her voice trembling. The father didn't answer. He simply kept walking, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. Cross leaned closer, whispering in her ear, "Whatever you do, don't speak to anyone you see here." Finally, they reached a heavy steel door. The father typed in a code, and it groaned open. Inside was a room filled with binders, photographs, and boxes stacked to the ceiling. He pulled one binder from the shelf and dropped it onto the table. "Open it," he ordered. Mrs. Callahan hesitated, then slowly lifted the cover. Her eyes scanned the first page, and her blood ran cold. Photographs of children, row after row, each one with a number printed beneath. And in the corner of every page, the same stamp, Halcyon Project. She flipped faster. More faces. Some she didn't recognize. But then, Emily, her brother, their eyes wide, vacant, staring into the camera lens. Beneath their pictures, not their names, only ID numbers. Mrs. Callahan's voice broke. "What is this?" Laura whispered, almost choking on the words. They're not supposed to exist. None of them. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. What do you mean? The father's expression hardened. They're not ours. They never were. They were created. Mrs. Callahan felt the room tilt. Created? She echoed. Cross's silence was confirmation enough. Before she could say another word, alarms blared through the facility. Red lights flashed across the concrete walls. The father snapped his head toward Cross. How did they find us? Cross pulled out his gun, cursing under his breath. We've got to move. Now. Footsteps thundered in the distance, growing closer with every second. And then, through the alarm, through the echoing chaos, a child's voice screamed. Mrs. Callahan. Her heart dropped. She knew that voice. It was Emily. But the sound wasn't coming from upstairs or outside. It was coming from behind one of the numbered doors. The alarm blared like a heartbeat gone wrong. Mrs. Callahan froze in the sterile hallway, her eyes locked on the numbered steel door. Emily's voice echoed again from behind it, desperate, terrified. But if Emily was inside this facility, then who, or what, was the little girl upstairs she had just seen holding her brother's hand? Move, the father shouted, grabbing Mrs. Callahan's arm. No, she cried, twisting free. She's in there. Emily's in there. Cross leveled his gun at the door. That's not possible. You brought her with us, remember? Mrs. Callahan's voice shook. That's not her. Not the real her. Laura Carter pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes flooding with tears. She whispered one word that chilled Mrs. Callahan to her bones. Clones. The pounding footsteps drew closer, echoing like thunder through the concrete halls. Cross swore and aimed down the corridor. We're out of time. The father slammed his fist against the door panel. She stays. If we open this, we won't make it out alive. But Mrs. Callahan couldn't move, couldn't think, because the voice on the other side of the door sobbed again. Weaker now. Please, help me. Mrs. Callahan's heart wrenched. She looked at Laura, at the guilt written all over her face. You knew, she whispered. You knew they were making more. Laura's lips trembled. They were never supposed to leave this place. The real ones died years ago. No, Mrs. Callahan shook her head violently. Emily is real. She's alive. And she needs me. Ignoring the father's protests, Mrs. Callahan lunged for the keypad. Her trembling fingers struck random numbers. A red light flashed. Denied. Cross grabbed her wrist. Do you want us all killed? Let me go, she shouted, struggling against his grip. And then, before anyone could stop her, Laura stepped forward. Her hands shook as she entered a code. The lock clicked. The heavy door groaned open. The smell hit first. Damp metal. Stale air. Rows of beds lined the walls, each one with restraints dangling from the sides. And in the far corner, huddled in a thin hospital gown, was Emily. Her hair was matted, her skin pale, her wide, tear-filled eyes lifted as she whispered, "You came." Mrs. Callahan's knees buckled. Oh my God! She rushed forward, gathering Emily in her arms. But Emily's small hand trembled as she pointed past her. Not safe. They're coming. Mrs. Callahan turned, and her blood ran cold, because behind the other beds, shadows began to move. Figures sat up. Children. Dozens of them. All with Emily's face. Some blinked, their eyes empty. Others whispered incoherently. One began to laugh, the sound high-pitched and broken. Cross cursed and raised his gun. We need to leave. Now. No. Mrs. Callahan cried, shielding Emily. "They are just children." The father's voice was ice. "They are not children. Not anymore." The alarms grew louder, merging with the sound of boots pounding closer. Mrs. Callahan clutched Emily to her chest as the other children began to rise, dozens of identical faces turning toward her at once. Their voices overlapped in a haunting chorus. "Help me, help me, help me." And then, all at once, the lights cut out. Darkness swallowed the room. Mrs. Callahan could still feel Emily's hand in hers. But when the lights flickered back on, she was holding the wrong Emily. Darkness. That was all Mrs. Callahan could see. Her heart pounded as dozens of whispers surrounded her in the pitch-black room. Voices that sounded exactly like Emily's. Some begging, some laughing, some sobbing. And then, the lights snapped back on. Her stomach dropped. The small hand she clutched in her own was not Emily's. The face staring up at her was smiling. But it wasn't her Emily. "Give her back." Mrs. Callahan screamed, jerking away. The other Emilys rose from their beds, moving in perfect, unnatural unison. Cross raised his gun. "We don't have time for this." "Don't shoot." Mrs. Callahan cried. They're alive." But the father's voice was sharp, cold. "They're copies. Shadows. If you hesitate, none of us walk out." Emily's real voice broke through the chaos. "Mrs. Callahan, over here." She spun and saw her, the real Emily, pressed against the far wall, tears streaming down her cheeks. The other Emilys turned their heads toward the sound, their movements jerky, mechanical. Dozens of identical faces, all fixated on the real Emily. And then, as if one mind controlled them, they began to chant in unison. "Help me, help me, help me." The father pulled Mrs. Callahan back. "We leave her. Now." "No." Mrs. Callahan shoved him aside, fire rising in her chest. "I will not abandon her. Not her." Cross barked, "Cover her," and fired into the ceiling. Dust rained down as the clones shrieked, stumbling in confusion. Mrs. Callahan charged forward, weaving through the chaos. She reached Emily, pulling her into her arms. "I've got you," she whispered, holding her close. "I'll always have you." The father yelled over the noise, "We won't make it back to the exit." Laura Carter, trembling, pointed to a steel staircase at the back. "There! Emergency access shaft." Together, they sprinted, cross-firing warning shots as the chanting grew louder. At the base of the staircase, the father blocked their way. "We can't take her." His voice cracked. "If she gets out, the others will follow. You don't understand what they'll do." Mrs. Callahan's chest tightened. "She's a child. Not a weapon, not a project, a child." For the first time, she saw doubt flicker in his hardened eyes. Emily reached out a trembling hand toward him. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them take me back." The father froze. His hand shook on the railing. And then, with a strangled breath, he stepped aside. "Go!" They climbed the stairwell, Emily clinging to Mrs. Callahan's neck. Below, the swarm of Emilys screamed, their voices blending into a chilling wail that echoed up the shaft. At the top, Cross kicked open the hatch, and fresh air rushed in. The night sky stretched above them, stars like distant lanterns. Mrs. Callahan collapsed on the grass, holding Emily as if she would never let go again. The facility alarms wailed behind them, but for the first time in weeks, Emily's sobs quieted. She was safe. Days later, the authorities swarmed the facility. The truth unraveled: experiments, illegal cloning, children stolen and replaced. But for Mrs. Callahan, the story wasn't about the science. It was about one little girl. Emily sat at her classroom desk once more, crayons in hand, her eyes brighter than they'd been in months. This time, when she wrote on her paper, it wasn't a cry for help. It was a single word: hope. Mrs. Callahan's voice carried softly, almost like a prayer. In the end, we are measured not by what we achieve, but by who we choose to stand up for. Especially when it's inconvenient. Especially when it's dangerous. Because sometimes, the smallest voices carry the loudest truths. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that someone else's life matters more than your own. When a child whispers for help, the greatest tragedy is not that they are in danger. It is when no one chooses to listen. You don't need to be a hero to save someone. You just need to care enough not to walk away. As the screen fades, Mrs. Callahan's final words linger. Sometimes, the difference between despair and hope is one person who refuses to look away.
The case may end here, but the questions don't. Don't let the trail fade into silence. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and turn on the notification bell so you're with us when the next story breaks. Because in the shadows of crime, the smallest clue can change everything. Stay vigilant. Stay curious. Stay with us. Behind the crime.